Good afternoon and boa tarde. On behalf of the Brazil Center at LLILAS, it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's book talk by Professor Lorraine Leu from the Department of Spanish and Portuguese and LLILAS at University of Texas. Professor Leu earned her PhD at King's College, University of London. She's the author of Brazilian popular music, Caetano Veloso, and the Regeneration of Tradition. And that book was selected by the year's work in critical and cultural theory as one of the most important books in the field in 2008. She's the co-editor of Latin American Cultural Studies, a reader which was published by Routledge. And since 2000, she's been an editor of the Journal of Latin American Cultural Studies. Professor Leu's new book, Defiant Geographies, Race and Urban Space in 1920s Rio de Janeiro, just published by University of Pittsburgh Press, examines how urbanization in Brazil's capital city leading up to the centennial celebrations of 1922, functioned as a technology of racial oppression, and how racialized subjects defied the implantation of dominant spatial orders in their vernacular mappings of the city. As a historian, I can say that to the robust historiography of urban reform and social inequality in early 20th century Rio, Professor Leu brings the theoretical richness and interdisciplinary method of cultural studies to create a highly original analysis of the nexus between racial and spatial marginalization, a scourge that continues to plague Rio and cities all across the Atlantic world. So it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Lorraine Leu.
Thank you very much, Seth, for that generous introduction. And thank you for the invitation to speak on behalf of the Brazil Center. I want to thank Paloma Diaz as well for organizing this event in this brave new world in which our dialogues and conversations take place in little boxes on a screen. And my thanks to Jossianna Arroyo-Martínez, who will be a discussant in this session. Jossianna has been a cheerleader for this project for many years now as a colleague and as chair. And I'm grateful for her continued support today. So I want to start with a couple of images that I've juxtaposed together on this slide. For me, these were the conceptual bookends of the project. They represent two different historical moments, almost a century apart, but that tell similar stories of disappeared geographies and the removal of racialized bodies from valuable areas of the city. The background image, which is on the cover of the book, is of a boy seated on top of a ruined house in a street near Castelo Hill. Castelo was a downtown neighborhood of Rio de Janeiro, demolished to make way for Brazil's first mega event in 1922. That was Latin America's first World Fair. This photograph is a record of loss. That street, that community were destroyed. And for me, it has a powerful affective charge because of the way the photograph portends that ruination. Also, because it obliges us to think about the experiences of these people, these children in this case, who lived precariously and dangerously in these ravaged spaces. This photograph documents a moment in which the city and the state made violent claims for the ownership of public and private places. Claims that would define much of the Afro-descendant experience of the city thereafter. The contemporary photograph that I layered on top of it is of Pedro Berto, a resident of Vila Autódromo. This was a community on the fringes of some very expensive real estate that was decimated to make way for the Olympic Games in 2016. I discussed this neighborhood briefly in the epilogue of the book. This photo is of his and his mother's house, which they refused to leave even when their utilities were cut and bulldozers damaged the walls of the home. Viewed together, the two photos become a potent symbol of the continuities of racialized, spatialized oppression and the stymied futures it creates. For me, it was important to understand mega event development as part of a long history of annihilation of racialized spaces. To make such connections visible is a critical move that helps us to understand better the racialized geographic present. How did notions of whiteness and non-whiteness produced the spaces of the city in the early 20th century, so that 100 years later, over 70% of Brazil's urban Black population lives in self-constructed housing. So the main focus of the book is the project to destroy Castelo Hill, to flatten an entire thriving hillside community of 408 buildings and 4,200 people right in the center of the city. To do it within 2 years with the technology available in 1920s Brazil, and to build a mini city on the site to host the World Fair. I wanted to know what such a crazily ambitious endeavor tells us about race as a national and a geographical project. What kind of anxieties and aspirations surrounding race are evident in a monumental urbanization project such as this? One thing that was immediately clear in municipal, state, and press discourse was the assumption that the targets of removal, the residents of this neighborhood, were ungeographic. That's in Catherine McKittrick's sense of the word, i.e. they were incapable of producing space, incapable of developing affective ties to space. So one challenge that I set myself for the book was to foreground instances of profound identification with and pride in place, whether in street battles, carnival associations, or the ways that residents express political resentments and organize to contest their removal. Even as the demolition crews moved in, people refused to leave their homes. Newspapers report injuries and deaths as buildings collapsed around them. I wanted to flesh out the archival traces of a vibrant neighborhood that is no more, but whose residents resisted till the end. Eventually, when they were forced out, they replicated their defiant geographies in other parts of the city, fanning out to the suburbs and to other hillsides. In fact, by 1926, a new informal community, a new favela, had already sprung up in the site where the World Fair had taken place. This rapid re-territorializing suggests that city officials faced quite a challenge in their attempts to invisibilize racial difference in urban space. The book analyzes a wide range of cultural forms, texts, and practices that result from the ideologies of the nation builders, as well as from the suffering and the resilience of those excluded from the dream of modernity. Why this place? Castelo was no ordinary neighborhood. The city was founded here. To be more precise, it was refounded here by the Portuguese in 1565, relocated because it was a safer place, more strategic location overlooking the bay. But the changing needs of the expanding settlement transformed Castelo from a site of colonial domination to a space stigmatized by poverty and criminality by the post-abolition period. The former slaves, capoeiras, and candomblé practitioners who had resided on Castelo were eventually outnumbered by waves of European immigrants. Black city dwellers and poor whites coexisted not just in the same neighborhood, but often in the same tenement buildings. As a result, the targets of early 20th century urbanization projects were also poor European immigrants blackened by their occupation of the same spaces of the city as former slaves. Conservative pro-urbanization press and public discourse often scripted these poor whites as Black. I argue then that whatever Castelo's racial mix, it was imagined and treated as a Black space by planners and policymakers, hence its disposability. One focus of the book then is Castelo as a site of interracial and interethnic geographies that meet, connect, and come into conflict. They have a complex relationship with dominant geographies, often challenging them, sometimes articulating with them, but always transforming them in some way. These defiant geographies forged unanticipated and sometimes even empowering subjectivities and coalitions. frequently remapping the neighborhood along ethnic, racial, and linguistic lines. For me, this defiance is a fundamental characteristic of Rio's racialized geographies. This creative capacity to continually invent and adapt spatial practices that introduce different bodies and cultures into urban spaces. Analyzing such encounters helps us to understand racialized spatialities in Brazil beyond the coexistence of a homogeneous pool. That has been the predominant approach to studying this period in Brazil's history. But I wanted to understand this moment as a racialized struggle to survive in the city. Why this moment? 1922 was a watershed moment in Brazil's history. The country was celebrating the centenary of its independence from Portugal and reflecting on its future. The World Fair was a showcase for Brazil's modernizing ambitions, and urbanization and whitening were conjoined and fundamental to the pursuit of modernity. So this period allows us to make direct connections between notions of urban progress and of racial progress. The mini-city built for the World Fair was the place that a white spatial imaginary built, though it was discursively produced as the site for celebrating the so-called raça brasileira. This was an imagined common ethnicity that relied on disappearing the Black population, what would later come to be rearticulated via mestiçagem. In the book, I reflect on what I call the politics of staying put, the defiant struggle to remain by Black and Blackened communities in the face of their destruction. I want to understand this key moment in national history when racialized herbicide was legitimated so that violence and trauma still characterized Black experiences of space and of home today. Staying put takes a huge physical and psychic toll when the spaces you occupy are considered outside the domain of legality, to use Denise Ferreira da Silva's term. It takes a huge toll when the spaces you occupy are subject to violations that are unthinkable for those meaningfully encompassed by the protections of citizenship. How does race make these spaces? How do urban policies, the built environment, spatial practices, public discourse, and culture produce the precariousness of the boy in Castelo sitting on the ruined wall? How do they produce the terror inflicted on Pedro Berto and his mother by threatening the structural integrity of their home, which also contained a community terreiro for the practice of candomblé? How do they produce the inhumanity of this particular image, which appeared widely in the international press 4 years ago? This is Luis Geraldo dos Santos, another former resident of Vila Autódromo, who had half of his house demolished because he and his ex-wife were joint owners of the home and she negotiated compensation from the city for her share. Staying put is about surviving in the city, but it also talks back to racial projects of modernization that treat these residents as unable to produce geographical knowledge and unable to invest emotionally in a space. So the book turned out to be about the ongoing struggle by racialized people for some place to call home. I guess that would be my elevator speech if somebody asked me to summarize the book in a sentence. I'd like to end with a bridge to my new book project, which is examining visions of home in Black visual culture in Brazil. Multimedia artists like Rosana Paulino are imagining new conceptual ground for thinking about the forms of oppression as well as the forms of life and knowledge that emerge from slavery's past present. This analytical vision of plantation futures is encapsulated in the notion of assentamento. The literal meaning of assentamento is a settlement, but it has several other meanings. In candomblé, an assentamento is the ritual of turning the earth into sacred ground and planting the collective energy of the community, the axé. Assentamento is also the laying of a base or the laying of a foundation. It can also refer to the act of recording or registering information. Paulino's installation, Assentamento, mobilizes all of these meanings to create a wide field of signification for racial capitalism. Central to the piece is a 19th century photograph taken during a visit to Brazil by Harvard biologist Louis Agassiz. Paulino sutures back together the female body after its violation by the white supremacist gaze. The sticks on either side of the figure recall their use as a percussive instrument in African-influenced religions, music, and dance. The bundles simultaneously speak of a dwelling yet to be built or a future imagined, as they do one destroyed. They are placed on crates that suggest the resourcefulness of self-built housing in Brazil, but are also a precarious foundation based on the materials of transport. The crates reference goods traded under the foundation, the assentamento, for the objectification of the female figure. Her loss of a homeland is a wound that never heals despite the attempt to suture. The sutures themselves are very visible, and while they put the body back together, they do so imperfectly, distorting its original form. The sutures speak to the meaning of assentamento as a record or a form of register by inscribing hurt, but also humanity in the imperfect attempt to heal. This violated body confronts us as a proposed site of Black archival production. Here, the notion of assentamento, of settlement, offers an alternative foundation for spatialized knowledges, born of Black geohistorical experience and inspired by anti-racist struggle. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Leu, for that presentation. Our discussant is Jossianna Arroyo-Martínez. She's a professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese and the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies at UT. She received her PhD from the University of California at Berkeley, and her research interests center on Latin American, Luso-Brazilian, and Caribbean literatures and cultures, the relationship between literature and the social sciences in Latin America, and critical discourses of race, gender, and sexuality in colonial and post-colonial societies.
Thank you, Seth. And thank you, everyone. Thank you, Lorraine, for inviting me to this event and to have the honor to read your book. It's a fascinating piece of work. I have a short reading, and I'm going to finish with some open questions to actually open the discussion for our panelists and for, of course, for the people who are watching this right now. So in her book entitled Defiant Geographies, Race and Urban Space in 1920s Rio de Janeiro, published by University of Pittsburgh Press, Lorraine Leu examines anti-Blackness and the role it played in the definition of state's Brazilian modern urban projects. Leu's Defiant Geographies is in dialogue with the work of critical race scholars in visual studies, urban geography, as well as with Brazilian scholars working on race, urban studies, and postcolonial critics in Latin American studies. In the 1920s, Governor Francisco Pereira Passos ordered the demolition of Morro do Castelo, a poor community in the center of Rio, composed mostly of Black and recent European immigrants, to create space for the World Fair that was celebrating the centenary of Brazil's independence. As Leu makes clear in her book, this was the first international World Fair even hosted in Brazil, as many World Fairs were held in 19th and early 20th century in European countries. We think about the Paris Fair in the 1900s, or the United States fairs in Chicago, for example, in 1893. Before that, Brazil held local agricultural or military fairs, as it also happened in Argentina, a country that is always compared to Brazil because of its geography and natural resources. Located in an area open to the Bay of Guanabara, the Morro do Castelo was one of the first colonial settlements of the city's foundation. Following a methodology of cultural studies that includes close readings of historical archives, chronicles of the period, visual media, including photography and cartoons, ethnography, architecture, urban design, along with theories of critical race studies and Black geographies, Leu's analysis moves from the early 20th century to the present. The main critical question of the book centers on the Brazilian early Republican modern project as one of whitening or branqueamiento, order and progress. As the last country that abolished slavery in 1888, and the site with the largest concentration of Afro-descendants outside of Africa, Brazil developed two distinct strategies towards progress and modernization. The first one was a state-sponsored European migration project that started in the late 1850s, and the second, the creation of a spatial modernity that, while being anti-segregationist, as Leu was making clear about before, still measured property, respectability, and decency from the bodies and actions of the white European upper classes. In this sense, Brazil's national project was no different from any other Latin American country at the time. The book opens with an introduction where Leu offers the theoretical foundation that contextualizes her study of Blackness and geography. Following the work of Catherine McKittrick and Don Mitchell, she looks at the particularities of how race makes space in the early 20th century Brazil. She looks at the main contradiction of a Republican state modern project that, although does not speak about race or Blackness, bases its modernizing goals precisely in displacing the Black and poor. Flattening Morro do Castelo was, above all, a measure to abolish the overtly visible presence of Blacks in the city, and with them, the remnants of slavery. Chapter 1 continues to problematize these solutions to race by identifying the diverse population of Castelo, mostly Black and European descended, but poor, as Blackened, right? As Black, and looking directly at Pereira Passo's reforms and the replication of Haussmann Parisian models. By analyzing cartoons published at the time, Professor Leu looks and works on the uses of irony and humor as forms of critique to articulate and negotiate resistance in the population. So this imprint of staying put was also kind of very visible in the same way that these authors were using irony and humor in the cartoons. Chapter 2 analyzes the foundations of the state project from the photography of Augusto Malta. To locate Blackness is a visual but also key problem for the modernizing state. Darwinist and eugenic theories of the 19th century sustain the theory that Blacks will disappear with racial miscegenation. Photography shows us the visual character of a Black population, mainly women and children, whose bodies defy demolition. Chapter 3 problematizes the notion of territory following Rachel Rolnick, providing close readings that tell stories where white spaces are challenged. Professor Leu follows histories of class struggle and defiance in the figures of the capoeiras and malandros. Chapter 4 focuses on the manuals of the World Exhibit and the event, its numerous and diverse visitors, and tells the story of Fortunata, a Black washerwoman who came from Sao Paulo to watch the exhibit and ended up giving her testimony of her travel to the main newspaper to assert her role as citizen of the new republic. Lorraine Leu offers a close reading of this testimony in a brilliant fashion to analyze citizenship and agency for Black Brazilians. In her epilogue, Professor Leu moves to analyze the contemporary struggle of residents of Vila Autódromo, a poor community close to the affluent Barra da Tijuca, a suburb of Rio de Janeiro, that faced the same threat of relocation and displacement as Brazil was preparing for the Soccer World Cup in 2014 and for the Olympic Games in 2016. By organizing themselves politically, several families were able to stay in the land in new houses provided by the state. Professor Leu ends her book with a meditation on contemporary ruination and the violence against Black bodies in the marvelous city that reflects on the complexities of belonging, negotiation, and futurity of Black peoples in Brazil and by extension in Latin America. I have 3 open questions that I will just make to Lorraine, but then, I mean, they could be included now or later in the discussion. So the first one is about the visual archives included in the book. I want you to talk a little bit about the archives where you found this, this great photography and these cartoons, and how these resources in a way are creating a type of counter-visual imaginary. I mean, your theory of staying put kind of like it's mostly recreated through this images. So I want you to talk about this a little. The second question is on the theories of architecture and urban design and how they work for your argument. How the racialized discourses around the Belle Epoque transform themselves as after the demolition of Castello or not. I mean, like the Belle Epoque, this is happening exactly at the same time as all the other projects were happening mostly in Central Rio, all these reforms. So I want you to discuss them together. So finally, an open questions on the arguments and your key arguments on the role of race, space and place that could be applied to Rio's contemporary discourses. And you end beautifully with your new project, which is great. I mean, like it's interesting. We see us like working on finishing a project and already starting with another one. And this notion of violence, right? Of the violence in the Black body and Black gender bodies, and how they reflect on discourses of anti-Blackness in contemporary Rio. Some Brazilian scholars, and I'm thinking about the work of Bruno Carvalho, will describe kind of like the interactions between violence, but also between culture and the city as more fluid. But you're kind of challenging that notion in your book. And I want you to talk about it a little bit more. Why, I mean, you think that this Brazilian culturalist approach is not what you want to share necessarily here, but what are you seeing in your depictions of anti-Blackness that is important to contemporary Brazilian scholarship? Thank you, thank you. And thank you for this great book, Lorraine. I really enjoyed doing this.
Thank you so much, Jossianna, for those reflections on the book. I haven't had any reviews yet, so it's great to get your feedback. And thank you for those provocative questions. The first one has to do with visual archives. In fact, one of the peer readers for the book manuscript suggested that on the strength of the visual material alone, Pittsburgh should publish the book because it just brings to bear so much, brings to light so much about this period, which is oddly understudied. A lot of the focus on urban reform has been on the Passos reforms of 1903 to 1906. Mm-hmm. For some reason, 1922, probably because of the Semana de Arte Moderna, passes much more despercibido, right? We have 3 very important historical analyses by Brazilian historians and some other small things, but not a lot else. So the material, I found some maps at the Arquivo Geral da Cidade do Rio, but most of the visual material I found at the Biblioteca Nacional in Rio de Janeiro.
So Lorraine, excuse me, like we want you to stop sharing the screen so we can see your face.
All right.
So you're talking, yes.
There we go. You are screen sharing.
No, like over here, yes. Excellent.
Yeah, so the experience of working at the Biblioteca Nacional was a real exercise in patience because when I started researching the book there, you would fill out a little paper ticket by hand and you would hand it over to the librarian. You were allowed maybe 2 or 3 at a time. They would go off, disappear into the entrails of that old building, and they would come back maybe 10 or 15 minutes later with the periodicals you requested. And you would sit there and realize quite quickly that there was nothing in those 3 items that was relevant to your inquiry. And then you started the process all over again with the little tickets. So I developed the Zen of Buddha when I started the research for this project. And in fact, I think I would have still been writing this book had the Biblioteca Nacional not digitized its periodical collection, which completely changed my life. So I was able to do a lot of work. The work that I started there in person, I was able to continue here. And I want to thank any of my students who might be tuned in for helping me with this, because there were times when I was overwhelmed with teaching or service, and they would carry on from my office here in Austin, pulling information for me about Castelo and about this moment and about the centennial. The sources are problematic, of course, because they're not self-representations by Black or Blackened city dwellers, really. They're generally mediated accounts by city officials, artists, cartoonists for national newspapers. And that sometimes offers us glimpses of daily life and of daily struggle, but it's often in third person. Sometimes these portrayals were very sympathetic. But even when they're not, or when they were not, they often would point to the limits of such representations. When a subject returns a gaze and resists certain racialized meanings, or denies us the gaze and denies us knowability, denies us the pleasure of them as an object of knowledge. So what I found, what was interesting for me, was the way that their active, affective, embodied engagement with the spaces that were depicted in these images often escapes capture by modernity's gaze, or exceeds it in some way, exceeds representation or exceeds knowability. So I think of this as the drama of racialized visuality. And I think that is exemplified in the cover photograph that I showed earlier of the little boy sitting on the ruined wall. That photograph was taken, as you know, Jossianna, because you diligently read the whole book, thank you. But that photograph was taken by the official city photographer, the first official city photographer of Rio, Augusto Malta. He was rabidly pro-urbanization, and he was hired to capture all the stages of the reform for posterity and also for indemnification. Because as we know with mega events, there is this haste and many buildings were destroyed before there was even a chance for the city to survey them properly, right? So a lot of people had their buildings destroyed and then were obliged to go to the city after asking for indemnification. So Malta was an active agent of this process of urbanization that was inflicting trauma on racialized and ethnic peoples in this poor community. And his photography and this particular photograph is a result of that. It's complicit with the state's whitening project. Yet, it's hard to feel unmoved looking at the image of this boy on, what may have been his house, what may have turned into a playground for him, this debris, this rubble. So for me, the challenge was to read the spaces between representation and possible realities, between the photographer and the subject, between intention and impact. That was the challenge of much of the book, and especially of that second chapter that deals very much with visual culture. And so for me, this image that, as I say, is the result of a complicity between the photographer and the city, has this afterlife that I reanimate by putting it in juxtaposition with the contemporary image of Pedro Berto in Villa Autódromo. This image has this afterlife that comes to represent a critique of dispossession, racialized dispossession. So the politics of these images, the politics of meaning production in them, the politics of producing them, and then the politics of consuming the images are something that are of great interest to me. And space really is the thing that around which I cohered these ideas. So that is my lengthy answer to your question about visual culture. The second question was about architecture and urban design. The entire book really is interested in built forms and their aesthetics and the meanings that they produce and how these work to naturalize race and space. Because the effects of this naturalization are profound. The effects of this naturalization can occasion your destruction as a poor, racialized city dweller. So during the Belle Epoque, which was late 19th century to more or less up to World War I, Rio saw these first sort of radical urban interventions, which were effectively forms of social engineering, right? As you said, to push people of color out of the city. And architecturally, the main target of this impulse was Belle Epoque buildings, right? It was, the idea was that the colonial style was ugly. It was insalubrious. It was too dark. The streets needed to be opened up also for purposes of public sanitation. And there's a whole, obviously, discourse and ideology behind that, much of which is motivated by a desire to leave slavery in the past, right? So they sort of sought to replace colonial buildings with Belle Epoque, with French Renaissance style. And they did that imperfectly and shoddily and partially, superficially, as Jeffrey Niddell demonstrated in his seminal book on the Belle Epoque. But of course, such is the ephemerality of modernity. But by 1922, suddenly the colonial was back in style again. And so I'm interested in the values that trend brought with it. And really, it was this moment of thinking about independence from Portugal and saying, we have this heritage. We are a European people, really. And our culture owes a lot to the Lusitanian race and to Lusitanian culture. And so they sort of recouped colonial architecture. They gave it a new name. I think it was called traditional Brazilian, they called it. All right, so it was this attempt to sort of tap into a recognized international architectural style and claim it for Brazil. But that trend was also very fleeting. Because as we know, 1922 was the Semana de Arte Moderna in Sao Paulo. And that would usher in a very different approach to architecture and to questions and ideologies of race that are associated with them. Because you also asked about how ideas about race were transformed after the centennial. And as we know, the 1920s is the moment where modernism and modernist architecture becomes implanted in Brazil and becomes this enduring aesthetic paradigm that's still rumbling on, really, for organizing space in Brazil. So in answer to your question, this is the moment in Brazil's cultural history that whitening gives way to ideas of mestizagem, both, of course, disavowing the Black population and both reliant on their disappearance, but the discourse changes, and that would lead the way eventually to concepts of racial democracy. In terms of architectural studies as a resource, I was very interested in this moment because this was the moment when the architectural profession in Brazil was consolidated. This is the moment when they founded their first professional associations and their first periodicals were launched. So it's a very seminal moment. What's that?
Very interesting that it's exactly precisely this moment.
It was precisely then, the year before, in 1921. These institutions were created and these periodicals were launched. And so it was a moment for the profession to kind of narrativize itself, to implot itself into a national narrative to do with space and the nation, and how to think the national community spatially. So that was very interesting for me. And I read, a lot of Brazilian architectural scholars were important to me in terms of the ideological constitution of urban design. And you mentioned Raquel Rolnicki. She had a quite provocative idea at the time. Since the 1980s, she's been criticizing Brazilian urban studies for not focusing enough on race and ethnicity and focusing too much on just class. And she had this idea in an article from like 1989 or 87, late 80s anyway, that really planted the seed for me in terms of thinking about Castelo and how to think about race and space in Castelo. She said that you could think about Black territories and you can identify a space as Black territory, even if it's not exclusively Black demographically. And that sort of blew my mind and opened a lot of doors for me in terms of thinking about how is this racialized space. And of course, it's also racialized because you have a large population of Italians and Portuguese. So the book is also concerned with the production of whiteness and how, how this space that was Castelo is counterposed to the space that was the World Fair, which was the ideal spatialization of whiteness. So that's another very long answer to your question. The last one. So your last question was about applying this historical case study to contemporary anti-Black violence in Rio. And also you were understanding what I do in the book as a sort of counterposing a culturalist approach where sort of there's this idea that the city is very fluid and the spaces are very fluid and an approach that sort of focuses more on the cultural interactions. Yes, I'm not sure what I'm saying yes to. Yes to the part that, if you look at the little presentation I just gave, I think it's very clear that I'm interested in these spatial histories because I'm interested in how they repeat themselves. And I think they're very important for unmasking the naturalized violence of contemporary race and spatial relations. And we have to know that history. For example, the statistic I quoted earlier, 70% of residents of informal communities in Brazil today are Black. If we know the history of how that came to be, we see that statistic in a different way, right? Put very simply, that statistic, that is by design. It's not by accident, and it's not by some inherent qualities of Afro-Brazilians that make them property shy in terms of legal property ownership, right? So I think one of the key points of the book is that we have to connect the dots in this national project of whitening by urbanization. Urbanization was only one of the tools, right? Mass European immigration was another, for example. But I think it's important to do that because then people who are organizing for racial justice in Brazil today have another tool with which to combat the enduring power and weight of racial democracy. Culturalist approaches. Okay, so I'm a cultural studies scholar, for better or for worse, probably for worse. And we're interested in the interrelationships between culture and society, right? We're interested in culture and the material conditions that people live in. Stuart Hall, a personal hero, once said about cultural studies, that cultural studies, with its insistence on just understanding the whole world as texts or forms of text, could sometimes feel very insubstantial when there are people dying in the streets, right? So those of us that have a kind of political investment and demand of cultural studies a certain political investment do want our work to be relevant and have some utility, and want to think about culture as a way of imagining a more just society. Anyway, Stuart Hall, maybe more than anybody else, really demonstrated for us the role that culture plays both in producing social difference and also in elaborating these decolonizing spatial and other logics that can talk back to coloniality. So to sum up, I'd say, you know, urbanism, it's a set of policies and it's a set of plans and it's designs, and but it's obviously a way that power is exercised in space, Foucault, but it's also a cultural institution. It's also an epistemological institution, right? Architecture and planning. So that's the approach that I took in unpacking violent forms of urbanization in the early 20th century. And I have to say, the word unpacking is a deliberate choice because much of the scholarship on this period has focused on race, the poor and the popular classes. And this is understandable because of the extent of coexistence between poor whites and blacks, recent European immigrants and immigrants from Syria and Turkey, who are all occupying the same spaces. So, you know, thinking about the idea of a porous city in Bruno's idea, yes, there was cultural interaction, right? And there were flows, and there was cultural cross-fertilization. And European immigrants sang sambas, and European immigrants created their own carnival associations. But they were very wary of being classified as Black. They realized, you know, not long after arriving that would not, you know, improve their prospects in their new home. So sometimes, you know, they were very careful to distinguish themselves from Black Brazilians. And they also went off and organized their own carnival associations and their own samba clubs. Sidney Shalyubi, you know, has done historical work that shows us rivalries in the workplace that often pitted Afro-descendants against different ethnic groups from Italy, from Portugal, etc. George Reed Andrews has also talked about Italians forming their own carnival clubs and the rivalries with Afro-descendant Brazilians being so intense that sometimes the Italians would have to hide in their consulate because of attacks by local Black carnival clubs. So yes, there's cultural exchange, but lest we forget, it's true, there are a number of important social and cultural spaces in which Black culture flourished and attracted wider participation outside of Black communities. And yes, this culture ended up defining a national culture. But with a culturalist approach, what you run the risk of losing, I think, is the violent processes of appropriation and reification through which Black bodies become separated from Black culture. And these processes are what explains why Afro-Brazilians, Afro-descendant Brazilians are still at the bottom of the heap socially today, while the descendants of these Italian and Portuguese immigrants have enjoyed a considerable amount of social advancement, right? It's the badge of white privilege. And so it's very important for me always to think about think about the social always in relation to the cultural. Thank you, Jossianna, for those questions.
Thank you, Lorraine.
So Lorraine, I just wanted to share with you some feedback that we've received from our audience. They're thanking you for talking about the history of the photograph, its origins and its afterlife, if you will, and what it tells us about the complicity of the photographer and its importance as a historical document. And also there's a great deal of interest in your new project, Assentamento. If I could join the conversation, it's interesting you started talking about Stuart Hall, because I did want you maybe to share with the audience, maybe like 3 or 4 of the theorists that you found most useful in undertaking this very ambitious project and how their ideas influenced your work.
That is a toughie because of what Jossianna outlined too, is the, cultural studies people, we get a bad rap, right? Because we're in everybody's business, right? We're in the archive and we're doing cultural geography and we're looking at urban design and planning scholarship, and we're looking at visual culture. All of these forms, cultural forms that I look at in the book often overlap. I do try and think about the production of race and space in each chapter through public discourse, through visual culture, through spatial practices, through planning. So it's as if in each chapter, there is somebody or a set of scholars with whom I'm dialoguing. Since people asked about the visual culture element, I have to say that I think I've really learned to read an image, a photograph, etc. Through Deborah Poole's very seminal book about race and vision and modernity in Latin America, which everybody must read if you have any interest at all in visuality and race. That really helped me to think about the ideological constitution of an image, but also these opportunities, these chinks in the structures of meaning that we can exploit to see if some different subjectivities emerge. And in terms of my, the technical, how to read an image, this is something I always recommend for students, is Gillian Rose's book, Visual Methodologies. And I have some key points from her book that I have next to my laptop at home that I go back to again and again. Also in terms of theorist and visuality, Nicole Fleetwood's book was very important for me to think about, again, the spaces between photographer and subject, for example, between intention and the myriad meanings that could emerge despite, that might align with or be very different from the intention of the photographer. So her writings about Black bodies and excess and a kind of politics of representation have been very useful for me also with this new project. And the new project emerged because I had so much fun writing chapter 2 of the book, which was on visual culture, that I thought my next book has to be just on visual culture. I'm going to be entirely self-indulgent. And I've been helped in this because Rosanna Paulino came to UT in February as part of the Lausanne Long conference that Kristen Smith and I organized. My colleague Adele Nelson in Fine Arts invited Jaime Laureano. There's been just a very, pre-COVID, of course, a real buzz around these, some of them established, but previously unknown, just breaking through and emerging Black multimedia artists.
Thank you. There's a question that's come in from Wilfredo Burgos Matos. He thanks.
Sorry.
First, he thanks you for pointing towards the possibility of hope and rooting for humanness and being in what we do and believe through our work. And with that said, he asks, what can decolonization and decolonial thought do to reimagine racialized spaces in Brazil and the world in general?
Mm-hmm. You know, Wilfredo, I know Wilfredo, and I know what he reads, and I know his own work. And I think, you know, what I said before about cultural studies people having this hope that what culture does for us as a society is to help us to glimpse different futures. A lot of the people that talk about a kind of arguing for a kind of Black humanity that's still elusive, people that talk about plantation futures, about thinking, yes, about the past, present of slavery, but also acknowledging Black human agency. They often conceptualize these ideas through culture, which is not surprising, right? So the paradigms are very spatial, right? The plantation and the weight of the plantation in creating and in perpetuating the afterlives of slavery. But we are offered, as Wilfredo says, some form of hope in terms of imagining alternative futures to that, acknowledging that trauma, acknowledging the way that it has shaped Black experiences of life, but also thinking that culture can give us glimpses of alternative rationalities to the ones that have structured our world to date.
I wanted to follow up with a question regarding the connection between the Semana de Arte Moderna, the same year as the destruction of Castelo, which is much better known in both, I guess, cultural studies and in history. So I had two questions on both the historical, as a historical event and as a historiographical event. First, were those artists, were those intellectuals aware of these urban reforms that were taking place in Rio? Did they comment? Was there any dialogue? And maybe as an aside there, those intellectuals, those artists were also very much interested in popular culture and like the povão, what have you. So, how would they fit into the, I guess, the paradigm that you're working with here for your Rio-based study? And the second one is like moving to reflect on like the generation of knowledge. Like, why do you think the Semana de Arte Moderna is better known and is more renowned in the scholarly literature, in the national histories, what have you, than the events that you're studying?
Sure. I think the ideologues of the centenary were quite anachronistic in their vision, right? This recuperation of Portuguese colonial styles and values, it didn't resonate precisely because of all of this urban reform as well. So the modernists, the poets, the artists, they were writing, they were depicting these changes. They were depicting the frenetic new pace of the city. They were depicting the sounds of automobiles on these, new Parisian style boulevards. So there was something very anachronistic about this return to colonial style, this appeal to their Portuguese heritage, when in fact the city was changing so radically. And yes, the modernists, as a whole, were interested in thinking about Brazil as more of an amalgam culturally and racially. So they wanted to certainly emphasize Brazil's uniqueness. And for them, that partly came from, right, the forest as well as the school and indigenous cultures and societies and Afro-descendant ones. But this is sort of the moment, and modernization becomes obviously what, Beatriz Rezende calls the Canonized Revolution, because obviously at the time it seemed quite progressive thinking to create a space within formal literatures and art and music for that racialized presence. But of course, the way that they were incorporated were often very abstract. I mean, not to generalize, people like Mario de Andrade really struggled, with the distance that he felt between himself and indigenous peoples or Afro-descendant peoples. He really struggled with his racial condition as a mestizo as well. And then you had other writers or painters like Tarsila de Amaral and Osvaldo de Andrade, who were really abstracting out the supposed contributions, say, of Afro-descendants to Brazilian culture, to the point where it becomes cinematic, right? The idea of just sort of flashes of images and vignettes that are really not historicized in terms of Black and indigenous genocide and struggle. But why did this take root much more than saying we are Lusitanians? Because it just sounded cooler, right? We are Parisian and yet we are Amazonian. And also, I think because of the appeal of that appropriation of these different cultures. The whole point is that Brazil is unique. I think it was easier to make that point in this process of cultural appropriation and reification than saying, well, what we're doing is we're taking Portuguese culture and we're reinventing it. And it was also the way of the world, right? Because of course, the 1920s, modernist architecture, Courvoisier coming to Brazil, there were a number of sort of external factors too that made that sort of appeal to that model of nationality more convincing at the time. And of course, we see it, you know, its results a decade later. You know, this idea of this cultural amalgam becomes the racial amalgam of racial democracy, and that is a wildly huge hit because it's sensuous, it's attractive, and it's an excellent way of appearing tolerant while continuing to disavow and oppress Brazil's people of color. So I think it's the sheer force of that idea of amalgam that also means that we don't, the Negro problem, as Nina Rodriguez famously called it, is solved. So it was a shortcut ideology, and I'm not surprised that the elites went that way. That's my theory on it.
Well, we don't have any additional questions from the audience, so I wanted to ask at this point if Jossianna or Lorraine would like to make any other points or observations before we close the session.
Yeah, I just want to say congratulations, Lorraine, in this timely contribution. It's definitely a book that is going to change, and it's already changing the thought, and the discussions on race and urbanism in Brazil for years to come. So congratulations. I'm really honored to be part of this panel.
Thank you so much, Jossianna.
And I wanted to thank both Professor Leu and Professor Arroyo-Martínez for presenting today, and the audience for participating in this wonderful event. So até já, and até logo, everybody, and thanks once again.
Thank you.